Howdy do, neighbor. It's Berean Spirits time once again. The boys have gathered around and they're ready for you. So join in, make comments, and study with the guys as they try to study as the Bereans did in Acts chapter 17. And now, here's the guys.
What a Thursday morning in December it is down here in beautiful Southwest Missouri. My name is Chris Peltz. I'm the evangelist with the Southside Church of Christ in Springfield, Missouri, where we're expected to hit nearly 60 degrees today. Man, oh man, I'm glad I'm not up in Minnesota. Richard Dotson with the Kearney Church of Christ up in Kearney, Missouri. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing really well. I'm glad that we don't have snow either.
Yeah.
Other than what's left from, there's still some pockets of snow that piled up from our 4 inches we got. But otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, I don't mind the snow. I just don't care for the cold, which you can't have one without the other, I guess.
No, you can't. And, you know, if I was down where you were at 60 degrees, I'd wet a line somewhere and be out there fishing.
Right? That's a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, Josh is not with us today, but Lord willing, he'll be back hopefully next week. Next week might just be our last program of 2025. Can you believe that?
Yeah, I guess it will be, won't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
what a year.
Well, the years go by. Life is a vapor.
Yeah.
It appears
absolutely.
for a little while and then vanishes away.
Yep. But before the year is out, we do have some pretty good topics I think we're going to be covering today, especially because here in Missouri, both Richard and I have been bombarded.
Everybody has been in Missouri.
Well, yeah, but yeah, that's what I'm saying. In Missouri, we've been bombarded with the sports betting that has been opened up as of December 1st. Made legal, and it has been pushed hard, whether it's on radio, TV, social media. I mean, just everywhere you turn, billboards. It's just there is advertisements and pushing for the sports betting here in Missouri, and it's just it's really wild, and it got us to thinking about the topic of gambling as a whole. I don't know when the last time we've probably dealt with this. Missouri's had gambling for a while with the riverboats, St. Louis, Kansas City, probably some places in between. There's been some loopholes when it comes to certain games that are in places like VFWs or some gas stations that have certain types of gambling slot games. And there's a new casino, I think they're trying to put in at Lake of the Ozarks here in Missouri, as far as like an Indian reservation or a tribe anyway, trying to get a boat on Lake of the Ozarks. But beyond that, it has been illegal for sports betting, but not anymore. Not anymore. And so this got us to thinking about the topic of gambling as a whole. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. And there are, I guess, several reasons, Richard, people try to justify it. And usually people are justifying something because they want to do it. And regardless of how we approach this, what we need to do is rightly divide the scriptures, because there's no one text in the Bible that says gambling is wrong. Thou shalt not gamble. But we come to certain conclusions based on patterns, based upon authority, and based upon what what God has revealed to us, and piecing everything together, um, and looking at motivation, even, right? I mean, covetousness is probably one of the biggest motivations for gambling anyway, which we're going to talk about for sure. But just to kind of set it up for us, Richard, if you want to, I know you've dived deep into this rabbit hole for several reasons, in looking at this kind of with a fresh perspective over the past few weeks. But um, you know, what, how would you start off really approaching this with somebody?
Well, when I'm talking to a Christian, a lot of times Christians, and this was actually brought up to me by the son of a gospel preacher when I was a young man. We were all out, kids were running around. And the young man brought up the fact, he goes, he said, gambling is very hard to disprove in the Bible. And, I'd always heard that gambling was wrong. I never really thought about, a verse that said, thou shalt not gamble. I just was a young man. So I really hadn't really looked into it. I was just doing, what I was told. There was some things that some people did that were really not wrong in and of itself. The older crowd, for instance, there were those in the older crowd, my grandparents and such, who thought playing cards was wrong. Not, you know, they were so fearful of gambling, they didn't even want to be associated with cards. Well, in my lifetime, I played cards many times. Nothing wrong with playing cards, but they were always afraid, where cards would lead to. And so, as a young man, when you start to mature and you see these types of things that are out there, like the playing cards is wrong, and you find out that it's not really wrong, and then you are introduced to the fact that the Bible doesn't say thou shalt not gamble. That makes you start thinking, okay, why is gambling wrong? Is this just some old wives' tale that has been passed down from generation to generation? And yes, I have. In my lifetime, I have really looked at gambling. I've had to deal with gambling up here with the riverboats being passed, the lottery. I know my wife, when the lottery was being approved, she worked on a project when she was growing up, to try to educate people on the fact that schools were not going to be benefited by gambling like they advertise. I mean, they do get money, but when they get money because of gambling, then the government money is reduced by that much. So I mean, it's not really a help, but they like to advertise it as such. And so, be that as it may, I've had friends who've worked at in gambling casinos, and yeah, it made me look at this to see if something's wrong. And I would like Chris, and I'll get your ideas on what these verses say. I don't want to be wrong about this, but there's two passages I'd like to bring to everyone's attention, because there is no passage that says that I know of, thou shalt not gamble. And like I said, I can be corrected if somebody wants to write in and say, yes, there is, here it is. I'll look at it. But in Galatians chapter 5, and this, Chris, I'd like to get your opinion too. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 19 through 21, it lists various sins that are categorized as the work of the flesh. And in verse 21, after it goes through, a list of various things that Paul calls as the work of the flesh, it ends up by saying envy, murders, drunkenness, and revelries, which I'm just catching up in mid phrase. But there's this part right here that I want to bring up, and it says, and the like, or in King James Version, I think it says, and such like. And he says, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I told you in times past, those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. And it's those things right there that tell me, okay, Paul's not making a hard list of the works of the flesh. He's given us a portion of the works of the flesh, but he's not giving us a hard, a hard, saying this. He's saying when he uses that phrase and such like, or and the like, he's saying there's other things. That's my conclusion. There's other things. Well, what are those other things? Well, I think in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 14, when he is making a comparison of the milk of the gospel and the strong meat of the gospel, he says this, and I think this kind of gives us a clue, and it kind of, I think, Chris, goes into what you were saying at the beginning of the show. Paul said, or whoever wrote Hebrews, I think it's Paul, but it says strong meat belongs to them who are full age, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. All right, so what I'm wondering is since there is no passage that says thou shalt not gamble, and there's other sins, as I think, things that may be wrong as well, that how do we determine if they're wrong? How do we know this isn't like Galatians 5:21 says, and such like? How do we know? How can we exercise our senses to discern good and evil? And I believe this goes back to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7 in his Sermon on the Mount. And I'll just read verse 15 through 20, if you don't mind. He says, beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. And he says, you shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes or thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree brings forth good fruit, and a corrupt tree brings forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that brings not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast in the fire. And there, this is the phrase, wherefore by their fruits you shall know them. And what I am thinking is that when we see something that is bearing bad fruit, then our senses should be exercised to the point we can discern good and evil. And that would be categorized as something that would be included in Galatians 5:21 as the and such like, or and the like. And Chris, I'd like to get your opinion on that conclusion on that.
Well, I mean, I think it's spot on. I think the way you set that up and walk through that very methodically, I think is helpful for a lot of people if they're willing to pay attention and truly seeking the truth. The idea of that such like, I think that one of the reasons I like that phrase and that particular text for this study, because when you look at what is mentioned and how many of those things are so often associated with gambling, right? I mean, you look at some of those things and you see what's associated with gambling. You see what surrounds it. And the environment that you place yourself in, of course, I mean, granted now you can do it from your own home with an app, but prior to that, look at what surrounded, everything about gambling. And that's what you have is those things. And I think also from that, when you going from Galatians chapter 5:21 over to Hebrews chapter 5, verses 12 through 14, you've got this idea now of, exercising your senses to discern good and evil. And I think that in and of itself shows you that the Bible doesn't always say, list every single sin. Thou shalt not do this. Thou shalt not do that. It's kind of like in the last chapter of the Gospel of John, where John writes that there are many more things that Jesus did, right? That where if they were written down, the world couldn't hold, all the books. And I think that's the point. God expects us to use reason and logic and the scriptures to put these things together and to understand what is good and what is bad. And ultimately it comes down to the fruit that is being bore, as you brought together there in Matthew chapter 7, 15 through 20, the idea of bearing fruit. What kind of fruit are you bearing when you engage in these activities? And so, my thought is just the way you laid it out. There's, what can you say against that? I mean, it's reasoning, just as Paul did in the synagogues. He reasoned with the Jews, putting these things together. I think that shows very clearly that there is reason, if nothing else, reason to question, right? And bring into doubt whether or not this is something that Christians ought to, whether anybody ultimately, but particularly Christians ought to be engaging in.
Linda Wilson shares a comment, and I think that it needs to be included, her thought here, because it does reflect, I believe, what Christians should be engaged in. She says our salaries are a gift, our blessing from God, which I agree. She says, I feel I should not gamble or spend money on the lottery just to lose it and waste it, as the money could go to my family and church. And yeah, she's right. What she's talking about is stewardship. And she's looking at her blessings as something the Lord has given her to be a steward over. I don't think anybody would deny that. Now, the question is as a steward, do we take a portion of that money, and sometimes do we blow it on what we call entertainment? Yes, we all do. We all, Chris, you and I like to fish. There's really no profit in it, but we will spend it on fishing. Does that mean we're not being good stewards with his money? I think Linda brings up a good point. There are those who look at gambling as a means of entertainment, and they feel like the money that they lose is like you and I going fishing. And the question, that I still bring to the point is that when we, when we don't catch fish, I mean, we're doing it for the love of fishing. And a lot of people who gamble, they may do it for the love of gambling, but again, Chris, you got to look at the environment, the fruit that fishing bears versus the fruit that is borne out by those who are gambling. And I think we're going to find out that, there's a vast difference between, somebody sitting on a dock and spending a little money to fish versus somebody who picks up an app on their phone and gambles. What are we contributing to? That's the thing that I think we really got to look at is what are we contributing to? Is this going to in some way help or benefit me and my service to God? Or is this going to hinder that which is, my service to God? And I think that's a big question that we all have to ask ourselves. And I know people can make arguments every way, but here's the deal. I have seen things with gambling that really makes me question its fruit, and I'll bring up some of these. Do people get addicted to fishing? Yes. Do people get addicted to gambling? Yes. But I just don't see as many people addicted to fishing like I do gambling. And when you're talking about our salaries are a blessing from God, uh, we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to use that money? Are we going to use it to feed an addiction? Which fishing could be wrong. When we start spending money that, especially monies that we don't have in order to fish, that could be wrong. But the gambling aspect of it is that, what kind of society are we feeding? What environment is this? And I think if you look at the environment of gambling, you're looking at people who lose money that feeds the industry. That's the whole point of the whole gambling episode is, if you don't have people who lose money, then you don't have an industry. And that's that I got a problem with, because that goes against what Jesus taught back in Genesis, that we are to work, by the sweat of our brow and for the things that the Lord gives us. He tells us to work with our hands, for the things that we have. And with gambling, we're actually trying to make something, that belongs to somebody else that they don't want to give up. And that right there should make somebody think like, this just doesn't feel right when they don't want to give up their money. I mean, they may be willing to gamble it, but they don't want to give it up, and that goes against the law of commerce. It does go against the law of labor. I mean, Chris, if I go to get a job from you and you say, look, I want you to work in my garden and I'm going to pay you this amount of money. Well, we got an agreement. And so there's no, you're getting something for your money and I'm getting something for my labor. Or if I go to buy something from you, if I say, Chris, I want to buy your car. Okay, I'm getting something for your car. You're getting something. Nobody is being, at a loss. And but with gambling, I'm actually taking something without giving anything in return. Now, I know there's such a thing as a gift. People can give a gift. We see that in the Bible, but you're not giving me your money willingly. You're reluctant to give the money in a gambling loss. You're not happy about it. And, that just seems to go against what I see in the scriptures with how we are supposed to live our lives, with contentment. Why do I want something that belongs to you and I want to take it without giving the things that, that need to be, given in order to be able to, that would be fair.
Yeah. So
gambling's not fair.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. One of the things is when it comes to that, the idea of a gift, right, is giving something and not expecting anything in return. And the passage slips me right now, but there's a text that talks about that very thing, right? I mean, that's you don't give something and then in order to expect something back. And so gambling isn't a gift, because when you gamble, you want something, you are coveting something, right? And so many people have this attitude. And I talked about this, in fact, in our Wednesday night Bible class last night, that so many people have this attitude and this motivation to try and gamble, first of all, for easy money, try to get something for practically nothing, right? And they see what is convinced, they've been convinced that this is an easy way to get rich quick. So it's a desire to be rich, which First Timothy chapter 6 condemns. It is a love of money, which is covetousness. And not only that, they have this attitude. Well, if I had more, if I just had, all this money, think about all the good I could do for the church. Think about all the good I could do for other people around me. And the problem with that is rather than use what you have for the Lord and to help others, you're withholding that, trying to get more, and usually the majority of people lose money, right? They lose that which they put into gambling, and so that money is just gone like a vapor, and and nothing good comes about it. Nothing good for those in need. Nothing good for the church. Nothing good for you or your family has come from it other than just simply loss. And then people claim, well, I'm a victim. You're a victim due to it, it's self-inflicted, right? You've engaged in this. You're the one who willingly gave, and while you were hoping to get something in return and it didn't happen, and you claim you're a victim. Well, that's what gambling is all about. And so it oftentimes is self-inflicted, and it also, as I pointed out, goes to that idea of, many people think, oh, well, I could do so much good. That usually means they're not doing anything with what they have now for good. And so, the question is, what are you doing now? Quit focusing on trying to have more, right? And just simply focus on what you can do with what you have. And gambling turns your attention away from that. Gambling turns your attention away from doing what you can with what you have, with what you could if if you had, but you don't. And so you don't do anything, at least not anything good. Very quickly, Richard, I know you mentioned going all the way back to Genesis about working with the sweat of your brow. Ephesians 4, verse 28, and 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 12 through 14, it mentions that very same thing, working with your own hands, right? Doing good, working with your own hands so that you can help others who maybe are in need. Notice, if you're going to help someone who's in need, you're going to give them a gift. How do you do that? It's not through gambling. It's through working and receiving a wage, working with your own hands, and then helping someone else who is in need. And again, it goes to show you the idea of using what you have to accomplish good rather than throwing effort after foolishness. And that I think people get caught up in, and they lose sight of what we ought to be doing and what we could be doing with what we have, rather than what might possibly happen, but usually doesn't.
I'm glad you went to Ephesians 4. I want to go there, and then at some point I do want to talk about the fruits of gambling.
Yeah.
But in Ephesians 4, and I do want to back up, you went to 4:28. If we just look at the context, there's a phrase right before that I don't think we should ignore. First of all, in verse 26, he says, be angry and do not sin, and do not let the sun go down on your wrath. And then he says this, nor give place to the devil. And then he says, let him who stole steal no longer. All right, that phrase, nor give place to the devil. When we're angry and we let sin fester, we're giving the devil an opportunity to tempt us. We're putting, temptation in our way. And, when we start thinking about gambling, isn't that what we're doing? Aren't we putting temptation in our door? Aren't we? I mean, there's all kinds of sins that we know are known associates with gambling. In fact, if you look at the advertising of gambling, at the bottom of each advertisement, it talks about, a phone number that you need to call, for those who are addicted to gambling, which, seems like, I don't know. Am I the only one that they're advertising gambling and they want to get business, but we're going to help you if if you buy too much of it? It just seems kind of silly. But needless to say, there is that phrase in verse 27, don't give place to the devil. Don't give him an opportunity. And I think in context, he's talking about your wrath. If you don't calm down, he says, be angry and do not sin. If you don't calm down, there's no telling where that wrath can lead to. You're giving the devil an opportunity. Well, there are situations, there are things in our Christian life where we have to be careful and not give the devil an opportunity. And, that's why I think we do need to focus on laboring, working with our hands, so that we can give to someone who has need. We have to look at the fruit of gambling and then ask ourselves, after we examine its fruit, is this something that, if I engage myself in, can this lead to even more sin? Can this get worse? And I do believe, yes. In Proverbs 13 and verse 20, it says, he who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will be destroyed. Now, what does that mean? Well, I mean, if somebody is doing things with their money that causes them to lose money, then if I'm their companion, then there's a good chance I'm going to be caught up in the same thing. I'm going to be doing something that's going to cause me to lose money as well. If I want to know the Bible, for instance, I want companions who know the Bible because they're going to help me learn the Bible as we discuss things. But if I want to be involved in sin, then I'm going to be having companions who are involved in sin, and that can lead me to get deeper into sin. And so I think there is a truth to be said there. When we look at the fruits of gambling, we have to ask ourselves, hey, I think a Christian can gamble, as long as they don't get addicted or anything, they're not sinning. Well, I think maybe you're just violating the very wisdom that the Lord wants you to show as a Christian. You're giving the devil opportunity. And if you're giving the devil opportunity, guess what? He walks about as a roaring lion. You're not going to beat him. He's going to get you. So why would you want to do that? That's the part that I don't understand.
Yeah. And this may transition a little bit into the fruit that you want to talk about before we get done with the program today. But the idea that but look at the hundreds of millions of dollars that we could win from gambling, from the lottery, from sports betting, whatever it is. All right, let's say you win $100 million and you're like, wow, now I can do so much for the church. I'm going to give 10%, $10 million that you give to the church. And the church, and you can look what the church can do with all of that money. Look at the church is able to do this. So much good could come about with all of that. Surely God would be pleased with that. You go to Mark chapter 12, and you've got Jesus there at the temple, kind of sitting back in the corner, it would seem, just kind of watching and paying attention, doing the people watching kind of thing. And there are people that are putting into the temple lots of money. And there comes this widow who puts in 2 mites. And first of all, Jesus is paying attention. That's the first thing we need to notice in that particular. He cares about our giving. But also, notice who he says gave more, right? The widow with 2 mites gave more than those because she gave out of her her necessity, or what she had, out of everything she had, rather than out of her abundance, right? The others were giving out of their abundance. It really wasn't costing them anything. To give, even though it was so much more according to man. But God was looking at the heart, and God was saying, here was a woman who had very little, and she gave all she had for the Lord. What she was doing with what she had And Jesus is pointing out, right, the fruit that she's bearing, she's laying up for herself treasures in heaven. That's the idea of the bearing of fruit that comes from that. And so you could look and say, but I could give so much more. And yet Jesus, he isn't praising those who were giving a lot. He was praising those who were giving, out of their livelihood as opposed to out of their abundance. And that's where true fruit is really going to be bore out. Go ahead, Richard.
I think that when we start thinking about gambling, and if anyone who's listening might be a younger man, I would just hope. I'm an older man. I'm in my 60s, and I've gone through this. So like talked about how I was introduced, to gambling as a young man. And I've lived my life watching gambling. I've watched how it got accepted in the society up here in my area, with the river boats and the lottery and all that stuff. And now we got the sports gambling, which makes it so easy to use your phone. I've seen these things. I've lived a life. And so now I want to share what I have seen. And I think this bears out. With gambling always bears corruption. There's always been corruption involved with gambling. You go to any casino, and what are you going to find at a casino? You're going to find prostitutes. You're going to find drunks because they serve drinks, and the prostitutes are not, they're not prosecuted by law there. So you have that taking place. You have organized crime that is associated with gambling. All these things have always been associated with gambling. And even with the way gambling got approved here in Missouri, there was signs of corruption. We had a speaker of the Missouri House, who had to, he got, if I remember, impeached because it came out that he was paid off to get gambling approved. So there's corruption there. I mean, constantly over and over again, we see corruption associated with gambling. And I can't help but go to passages like 1 Corinthians 15:33, be not deceived, evil company corrupts good habits. Proverbs 29:3, whoever loves wisdom makes his father rejoice, but a companion of harlots wastes his wealth. Well, the harlots associate with gambling. Evil company associates with gambling. All these things, have always been associated with gambling. And so you, like Jesus said, you look at the fruit that it bears. You look at the lives that have been destroyed by gambling. And you got to ask yourself, is that for you? And not only is it for you, is it good for society? Because what it does, when one person loses all their money gambling, that affects their family. That affects their children. That affects their ability to pay their bills. And then that means that affects those that person owes. The landlord, he's affected by it. And so you got to ask yourself, you look at money, people who offer these gambling addictions, they do so to make money. They're not doing it to lose money. It's like that famous saying, Vegas was not, it wasn't built on winners. It was built on the backs of losers, people who worked and then lost their money there. That's how Vegas was built. That's how all these things are built. People are using the foolishness of men to take their money. And so when you look at the fruit that it bears and what it does to a society is it just sucks the money away. You got to ask yourself, is this something Jesus wants us involved in? Is this contentment? Is this labor? Are we being a good steward with the Lord's blessings? And the answer to all that's no. And so it goes back to what I said in the beginning. You look at the fruit that it bears, and so your senses need to be exercised to be able to say, this isn't good. This isn't someplace that I want to be. And Chris and I talked about this show before we even did it. And I said, Chris, go to a casino and start preaching. Have a church meet in a casino and start singing hymns. They're going to kick you out. And the reason is nobody wants to hear God's word being taught in a casino. Nobody wants to hear God glorified in songs in a casino. They're going to kick you out. And so if God himself is not welcome with such people, then why do you want to be there? What did Jesus say? Shake the dust off your feet. Go to the people who are looking for God. Because I can promise you this, the gamblers aren't. They're not looking for God.
You mentioned Proverbs 29 as we kind of wrap this up. And a lot of times people would focus on the idea of the harlot there. But what does it say? Right? They waste their wealth. And I think just within those two, we're wasting wealth is an idea that God doesn't expect us to throw things away, just throw money away, regardless of what it is, especially if it's, obviously concerning harlotry, sin. But he's condemning the wasting of wealth. And I think that in and of itself shows you, God, gain is in godliness with contentment. 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 6. There's where our great gain comes from, in godliness with contentment. And that's where we need to be focused and bear fruit for God, right? Bear fruit for, the fruits of righteousness, and doing God's will. So, Richard, any last thoughts? I know we've gone a little over, but go ahead and then we'll wrap up.
I do want to share, there was something that took place this week that kind of shows you the fruits of gambling. There's a man named David Portnoy, and he owns this thing called Barstool Sports. It's basically like a gambler's almanac kind of a thing that he put out. But now they got like a casino, they got apps, and he's been in Missouri advertising on social media his app. He's been on TV advertising his app. We've seen him everywhere. Well, there was a football game Sunday that ended, I got to admit, the football game ended very suspiciously. And it has been proven. I mean, right now we do have an FBI investigation into the fixing of games in pro sports. That's been going on. But David Portnoy gets on Twitter and he goes into a rage because he feels like this game has been thrown and he's lost money on it. And I would invite everyone not to listen, but to double check me, but not to, he curses, or I would be playing it here. He actually called for the murder of one of the coaches involved in this. And he called for that on social media. And the only reason I'm bringing that up to you is that's the guy who's trying to sell you on gambling. He's the guy. He's trying to sell you on gambling, and he's calling for the murder of a head coach. Now, if you think that's what Christ want his saints to be involved in with people like that, then I don't understand my Bible. Yeah. That's my last point.
And he, real quick, just in case, he did say he retracted that statement, right?
It doesn't matter; it's already out there.
I know, but just to cover our bases, just in case.
Yes, he did. He apologized the next day, but still.
Yeah, but that's the kind of person
who says things like that on social. Yeah. He knew it. He had to, first of all, record what he said, and then know what he said, and then actually publish it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
So, I
right.
mean, he knew what he was doing.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you have to ask yourself, if he'd had a gun, he was so angry. If he had had a gun and the coach had been there, would he have used that gun? As
Mhm.
mad as he was, who's to say?
Yeah. Yeah. Folks, we do appreciate everybody who tunes in and listen. Be sure and hit that subscribe button, hit like, share it out with all your friends and family. And we just really do appreciate all the support we get by folks who listen and comment, and it just really helps us out so much. Hopefully, we'll be back next week, but that would be the last program for the year, 2025. So we're looking forward to that. And hopefully Josh will be back with us next week before so we can wrap up the year. Until next week, though, remember to search the scriptures with Berean spirits.
Well, folks, that's all for today. Don't worry. Lord willing, the guys will be back next week for another Bible study on Berean spirits. Until then, let the guys hear from you. Drop them some email at bereanspirits@gmail.com. They'd love to hear from you. Until next time, let's keep studying that Bible.